Dr. Napier, can you see me?
I can indeed, thank you, yes.
And you can obviously hear me, that's good. That's the right place to start. The next thing we have to do is to swear you in. But let me first of all explain where we are and who you're talking to. We are here in Aldwych. There's a small audience here listening to what you have to say. There will be a much larger one online, so you're speaking to them as well. Now, you are at your lawyer's office, are you, in Cardiff?
I am, yes.
And is there anyone there with you?
At the moment, there's nobody in the room.
Thank you. Now, Camilla will now ask you to take the affirmation.
Please state your full name.
John Anthony Francis Napier.
Thank you. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Now, Ms. Richards will now ask you some questions.
Dr. Napier, can you see and hear me?
I can.
I'm just going to start with an overview of your career. You qualified as a doctor in the 1960s, I think.
Yes.
And then you held various junior posts 1965 through to 1969 in medicine, surgery and pathology.
Yes, I did.
And then between 1969 and 1972, you undertook research as a Wellcome Research Fellow. Is that right?
I did.
And I think the subject of your research was a hormone known as EPO. I'm not going to try and pronounce the correct name. Am I right in understanding that's something the kidneys produce to stimulate the production and maintenance of red blood cells?
Yes, it's the hormone which tells the body to make more red blood cells. It has become, or it did become popularly used as a blood doping agent in athletics, which is unfortunate use. But originally, of course, it was hoped to help patients suffering from various sorts of anemia.
Then in 1972, you took up a post at the University Hospital of Wales as a lecturer in haematology. Am I right in understanding that entailed both teaching and clinical responsibilities?
It did, yes.
Could you tell us broadly what the clinical role was in the 5 years or so that you were there?
It would be the general diagnosis and care of patients with blood diseases. There would be various sorts of anemias, patients with leukemia, patients with disorders of their bleeding system, such as haemophilia, both inpatient and outpatient care of those. It also included some teaching duties, and I was continuing some research on the erythropoietin at the time.
Did you spend any time in the hospital blood bank during that period?
Not actually in the blood bank, but I would have been involved at times if problems arose in the blood bank about demands of blood that had some special requirements or couldn't be met, such like. But I wouldn't have had a great deal to do with the actual working of the blood bank.
Then in 1977, you took up a position as medical director within the Welsh Regional Transfusion Service.
Yes.
And to put it another way, I think you were the regional transfusion director of the Cardiff Blood Transfusion Centre.
Yes, it was a blood transfusion centre that covers most of Wales, apart from the areas of North Wales, which are served by the Mersey Transfusion Centre. It was based at Cardiff, but the service was covering most of the rest of Wales.
And you remained in that position for a little over 20 years until 1998. And then between 1999 and 2002, you were a part-time medical director of the Welsh Blood Service.
Yes.
I think you've written a range of papers over the years in the field of haematology and blood transfusion. And you also published a book, Blood Transfusion Therapy, in 1987.
I did, yes.
And a second edition, I think, in the 1990s.
Yes.
Just one further point of detail before we start to look at the substance of your work. If we look at your witness statement, WITN 6915001, and if we look at page 4, please, Shomik, paragraph 15, just over halfway down the page. So I think you were asked whether you'd been involved, so if we go up, thank you. You were asked whether you'd been involved in any litigation, and your recollection was that you'd not been involved. I think you'll have subsequently seen a letter. I just want to ask you to look at that and see if you can remember anything further about it. It's DHSC 0003969_046. This is a letter from you to Dr. Raymond at the Department of Health, March 1996. And the first paragraph says you've been asked to advise with regard to a claim against the North London Blood Transfusion Service by a donor who contracted hepatitis B. Do you have any further recollection now of your involvement in that litigation?
And until I saw a copy of this letter, it had completely disappeared from my memory, I'm afraid. I've got no recollection of it whatsoever. I don't think I would have been involved to a great extent in this, perhaps commenting on some evidence presented to me. But I at the time I compiled my witness statement, I had completely forgotten all about this.
Yes, and I think you'd only been sent this letter recently. Do you know whether you produced a report or in connection with the litigation, or can you not recall?
I don't think I did. I don't think I had a great deal of involvement in it. I probably commented. I've really got no idea at this stage. In general, I'm afraid that in preparing myself for this inquiry, none of my personal papers that were kept at the Welsh Blood Service are available. The only information I've got to help me in this inquiry is the material that you sent me through the egress system. My own personal correspondence and papers at the blood service prior to about 1990 don't seem to be available.
Okay, thank you. We can take that down, Shomik. Can we put the witness statement back on screen? I'm going to ask you next, Dr. Napier, a little about the Regional Transfusion Centre itself, the centre in Cardiff. And we can pick that up if we look at your witness statement. Again, it's the same page, page 4, but the bottom of the page. WITN 6915001. Six 6915001. So if we just look at the bottom of the page, you say there that the service was based at, is that Rhyd Lava on the outskirts of Cardiff?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Over the years employed between 250 and 400 staff, and then you explain that comprised a management team with administrative and clerical support, mobile blood collecting teams, laboratory staff for testing and processing of blood components, research and development, and if we go to the top of the next page, and a quality management team. And then you explain in paragraph 17 that in 1997 the operation moved to a new purpose-built centre on the site at Talbot Green. We'll come back to a number of different aspects of the centre's workings in due course. Can you assist us with understanding how many clinically trained staff, very approximately, there would have been employed at the centre in the 70s and 80s, in terms of doctors and nurses?
I'm relying on my memory here, but I think we probably had something between 6 and 10 trained medical staff, and perhaps the same number of nursing staff. But the blood collection teams were manned by a special category of donor assistants, and they had their own training program. They weren't nurses; did wear a uniform resembling that of a nurse, but they were specially trained as blood collection staff. But I'm afraid my recollection of the numbers is I don't have the data, and it changed over time, and I just can't give you precise figures.
Don't worry, it's just to get a rough understanding. You said at the top of the page there that from the early 1980s, the working processes of the centre were computerised and managed by an in-house team. What did that computerisation mean in terms of the working of the centre?
Well, one of the requirements of a blood transfusion centre is you aim at 0 errors, and that is that you mustn't make any mistakes with regard to the labelling of something or the assignment of the blood grouping of something. It must be absolutely correct. And historically, a lot of the information of the centre would have depended on writing labels on tubes of blood, transcribing that information onto other pieces of paper, and again onto other pieces of paper. When the system is completely computerized, you rely on mechanical systems, barcoding of the samples collected from donors, and the machine reads those in the way that we're familiar with nowadays. The computer handles all the information processing, and you can build in checks to do as best you can to ensure that it's safe and there are no errors. And so you then got a high degree of confidence that a bottle of blood, say, that is issued to a hospital and is assigned to be group A positive, it really is group A positive, and you know what hospital it went to, you know the donor that donated it, and you can be in touch with all the other donations that donor gave. And the objective is to tighten up the whole of the management of information throughout the centre in a secure and error-free fashion.
Now, in terms of your own, so we can take that down, Chairman. In terms of your own role and responsibilities as the medical director or regional transfusion director, you said in your statement you were responsible ultimately for every aspect of the blood transfusion services activities through the centre. Could you give us a sense of what in a typical week in the early 1980s your role as a regional transfusion director entailed? What would you actually be doing?
There would have been quite frequent meetings with a management team, and the management team would comprise, my deputy director, who'd have definite responsibilities with regards to the donor panel, the recruitment and care and safety of donors. We'd have had a senior nurse who had been responsible for the team of nurses helping with the blood collection activity and assessment of donors. We would have had somebody in charge of the donor organisation team responsible for the recruitment of donors and the setting up of donor sessions. There would have been a member of the head of the laboratory team who would be responsible for the manning of the laboratories and the workload of the laboratories. There'd have been the computer team responsible for the systems that I've just outlined. A little later on, and I can't remember the exact date, we would have had a quality assurance manager whose responsibility would have been to ensure that all our objectives in terms of documentation and safety and security were actually achieved. We would have met and discussed how we were doing and anticipated problems. And if we were concerned, for example, about blood shortages, the measures that we were taking to address that, if there had been any incidents of any sort, donor complaints or problems related to hospitals, we would have discussed those. We would have discussed recruitment problems of staff. We would have discussed our relationships with the clinicians and with hospitals, and any day-to-day issues that might have occurred.
Okay. And we'll come on to some of the specific types of meetings, regional transfusion director meetings and the like, that you would have also attended in due course. I want to ask you a little now about the lines of accountability and the way in which the centre was organised within Wales. You've already indicated this was the only centre in Wales. And I think you tell us in your statement the areas supplied would have been South and West Glamorgan, Gwent, Powys and Dyfed. Is that right?
Yes.
And then North Wales was supplied from the Mersey region. Do you know why that was the case? Was it simply that physically that was closer?
Well, that was the historical arrangement, and in fact, the logistic difficulties of transport between North and South Wales aren't easy, and whereas the transport links from North Wales to Mersey are relatively easy, and it was a natural grouping, which I think dates from some time after the reorganization of the health service after the Second World War, in the early 1940s.
Was there any particular liaison or coordination that took place between you and your centre in Cardiff and the Mersey Centre, or in relation to matters covering North Wales?
No, there wasn't. No, I think the Mersey Centre was, our relations were much the same as they were with any other centre in the United Kingdom.
Now, when you took up your post in 1977, the Regional Transfusion Centre and the service that you were responsible for was accountable to South Glamorgan Regional Health Authority.
Well, it was managed by South Glamorgan Health Authority. My personal medical accountability was to the Chief Medical Officer in Wales, but in terms of the operational logistics of the service, it was under the care of South Glamorgan Health Authority.
And that remained the case until, I think, 1991, when the Regional Health Authority's responsibility transferred to the Welsh Health Common Services Agency, and then later to Velindre NHS Trust.
Yes, that's the case, yes.
You describe in your statement your understanding that the Regional Health Authority managed the service on behalf of the Welsh Office. To what extent did you have direct dealings with the Welsh Office, and what was your understanding of its role?
I did have, I had personal contacts with the Chief Medical Officer, so where there was a need, there was dialogue. But I think that the position of the transfusion service, ours in Wales, I think probably wasn't unique. We wrote letters under the heading of the National Blood Transfusion Service, giving the impression that it was an England and Wales National Transfusion Service. In effect, the pay and rations basically came locally in many parts of England from regions, and in Wales from the Area Health Authority in South Wales. That's where, I suppose, general accountability or performance accountability was handled. In fact, the national objectives, such as they might be for the health of the blood transfusion service and the things that we'll come to later in terms of safety and self-sufficiency, these really were not part and parcel of the dialogue with the local regional health authorities, or in our case, the Area Health Authority. So we were working under, as I said, the banner of the national service, but in fact, the bulk of our organisation discussions were with our local regions or health authorities.
And the Chief Medical Officer to whom you say professionally responsible was the Welsh CMO, Dr. Gareth Crompton?
It was, yes.
And we'll come on to a handful of meetings that we have records for, attended by Dr. Crompton in due course. In principle and as a matter of generality, would it be right to understand that as a autonomous independent transfusion centre, it was open to you to set your own policies, make your own decisions, take your own course, but in practice on issues of major policy, the regional transfusion centres across England and Wales generally sought to work together?
I think that's true. Although the guidelines of the transfusion service evolved over the decades, right from my arrival at the centre, certain things were understood to be shared, and that is, for example, the care and selection of donors. We operated from a blueprint that was shared amongst the services, and as far as possible, I think most regional transfusion services adhered to that. If there was any local discretion, it would be on minor aspects, but in principle, we were trying to follow a national blueprint.
Now, in terms of the centre services funding, yours came from the South Glamorgan Health Authority, and your understanding, as you describe in your statement, was that it was top sliced from the overall Welsh health funding. So there was a certain amount that would effectively come to you based upon a historic position. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
And then in 1990 or thereabouts, the system changed in terms of funding. Do you recall whether there were any particular advantages to the change?
I think you're referring to the changes that went out throughout the health service. Yes. In terms of cross-charging for services. I initially thought that would solve one of our major problems, namely that we were usually trying to provide this year's work on the basis of last year's funding, and we were always, in essence, short of cash to do the work and development that we wanted. And it did seem to me that if we were able to put a charge on the items of work that we would do or send to hospitals, that might automatically provide the income we wanted to, much in the same way as a commercial organisation might do. I had thought initially that would be an advantage in terms of running the service. It soon became apparent to me that the actual cost and mechanics of putting this system into operation added to the cost of providing transfusion services, and I don't think we got commensurate advantages. For example, that a hospital has to have the blood it needs. There's no way it can say we've run out of money, we can't pay the bill. It has to. We have to supply the blood that it wants, and I did feel that we spent a lot of time in meetings and discussions about the costs and the mechanics of doing this, which and we didn't get the benefits of the cross-charging arrangement, not in the way that was first envisaged. I think that the situation might have been rather different with regards to the provision of plasma to the blood products laboratory. I think that that system, had it been introduced much earlier, might have solved some of the problems that we faced.
That's an issue we'll come back to in due course later in the day, Dr. Napier. Just want to ask you to look next with me at a couple of letters from the early years of your time as director, in which you raised concerns about the funding of the centre and facilities at the centre. Shomik, could we have BMAL 5023, please? This is a letter from you, Dr. Napier, dated the 19th of November 1979, addressed to Mr. Williams, Welsh Medical Committee at the Welsh Office. What was the role or function of the Welsh Medical Committee?
What I was trying to do in this letter was to make progress against long-standing problems. The buildings that we were housed in, that Lead Labour, were outdated World War II temporary accommodation, and I did feel it was an imperative that the centre was rehoused in modern accommodation that was spacious, that was the required standard for operating the laboratory procedures that we were undertaking. We wanted, therefore, a larger, more modern centre. And I think we also had issues about funding the service that we needed to address. The most pressing problem, I think, was that the requirements, the needs for blood and blood products were increasing. We found it difficult to house the equipment and the staff to do this. And I'd been lobbying all the organisations that I could to gain support for the fact that we were under-equipped to do the job that we were required to do.
And we can see that, if we pick it up towards the bottom of the page, please, Shomik, the last two paragraphs. You said this in your letter: the Welsh Regional Blood Transfusion Service has been for 25 years housed in wartime temporary accommodation, which is now in very poor condition and about half the size it should be. Space is a very severe problem and it causes serious risks of errors in a field such as blood group identification, where these are unacceptable. The need for a new centre was first realised over 10 years ago, but insufficient impetus was obtained for this to be realised. Since then, the situation has become desperate and will get even worse. And then you go on to talk about, I think, the point you were just making, Dr. Napier, in the next paragraph. The overall blood intake is now 3 times greater than in 1956, soon after the present building was occupied. More importantly, blood component production, which hardly existed 10 years ago, is now a major part in our life. At present, over 50% of blood is subdivided into products, i.e. approximately 16,000 cryoprecipitate donations, 25,000 fresh plasma donations, 13,000 platelet concentrates, to name some. And then if we go to the top of the next page, we'll turn it round so that we can read it. There's a chronic need throughout the United Kingdom for more plasma protein fraction, and you go on to talk about that, and then picking it up 5 lines down, having referred to purchases of commercial materials, you say this is financially and morally unjust, can only be avoided by expanding blood intake so that the UK, and in particular each region, is self-sufficient. And then in the next paragraph, you talk about, in the 4th line, the workplace being overcrowded and substandard, and you say this: I've no doubt that were we to be visited by a representative from the Medicines Inspectorate, our blood processing facilities would be shut down immediately. And you go on to talk about difficulties both in terms of space and in terms of recruitment and retention, and indeed space for staff. And then if we go to the 3rd page, we look at the 2nd paragraph. You say, as a result of making repeated representations to South Glamorgan Health Authority and the Welsh Office, I hope that the case for rebuilding the new blood transfusion centre will be reconsidered. So you were, I think, setting out a case there and a number of reasons in support of that case for funding for a new regional transfusion centre.
Yes, that's the case. I think the problem that we had is that South Glamorgan Health Authority, and of course Wales in general, has many other calls on its capital building programme, the requirement to replace district general health authorities with new hospitals. And what I was trying to do in this letter was to get general support throughout the Welsh medical community to say the blood transfusion service should be moved up the priority list in this capital programme. It is my regret that it took so long to achieve this. And I was, at the time of writing this letter, very unhappy that I felt that our accommodation in these rather old World War II era buildings was just not adequate for the job that we were being asked to do. And that job had changed immeasurably since the service was first housed in those premises.
And then I'm going to ask you to look at a letter you wrote a year or two later, June 1981, along similar lines, DHSC 40796. This is a letter from you, 9th of June 1981, to the chair of the South Glamorgan Area Health Authority. And it would appear that rather than having additional funding, you were being asked now to make cuts. It says the authority still requests the Welsh Regional Transfusion Service to make staff cuts, despite this action being very much out of line with transfusion service plans in England and Scotland. I appreciate the severe financial problems the authority is facing. However, the authority did assume responsibility for the Welsh Regional Blood Transfusion Service, and it should therefore make arrangements to do so in such a way that Wales keeps in step with the remainder of the United Kingdom. It is clear from my contacts with other transfusion service directors that this is not at all the case. We will have to cut blood collection, processing and provision of blood products to the Welsh region. Productivity has grown disproportionately to staff numbers, but at the expense of other important activities. It is neither ethically nor economically defensible to reduce local blood transfusion activities before curtailing purchases of imported blood products. This will be the direct effect of the authority's action. And then you refer to a document that you were enclosing. I'm not sure whether that was a letter about retiring donors from the service or whether it was a different document, but I don't think it matters. The import of your letter, I think, is sufficiently clear from the terms in which you wrote it. Can you recall whether this plea not to have further cuts or cuts imposed upon you, how that was responded to by the authority?
Well, my recollection, this was an era in which there was concern that the health service was spending too much money on certain layers of managerial and clerical work, and this needed to be pruned for the sake of the economy and efficiency of the service. My point was that many of these staff posts were directly involved in handling the information with regard to recruitment of donors, or staffing blood transfusion sessions, and if we were to cut those, then we just wouldn't be able to handle the throughput of donors that was required. My recollection was that we weren't actually required to make those cuts. I think, in essence, I think my letter appears to have been successful in that, but I think we were threatened at that stage, and I think probably all areas of the health services were probably required to, for example, reduce a certain percentage of their staff in certain categories. And I just was trying to make the point that we weren't able to do that without risking our blood collection total. And I think I would also said that if we didn't provide the blood to the hospitals would have to respond by reducing their ability to deal with elective surgery and such like. And so it would have significant consequences for the whole of the health services if our blood collection activities were throttled back.
Your statement tells us that eventually in 1997 the service moved into a new purpose-built centre. But in relation to the 1980s, did the funding position that we've seen described in the correspondence we've looked at, did that improve materially in the 1980s? Or was it still very much a question of there not being enough funding to run the service in the way you would have liked?
It was always an issue, as I said, trying to do this year's work on the historical funding allocation of the previous year. I mean, I think we had reasonably harmonious and efficient relationships with South Glamorgan Health Authority. They had their own problems in funding services, but it was always a struggle.
If we look at your statement again, Dr. Napier, WITN 6915001, and if we go to page 23, please, Timmy. It's paragraph 89. you say this, that the Welsh Regional Transfusion Centre had to press its case for resourcing the above-mentioned activities to the Managing Health Authority. These bids would be in competition with all other funding issues faced by the Health Authority. In my opinion, a more appropriate solution would be for the service to have been funded directly from central sources, where the significance of the issues at stake might have been better appreciated. Can I just ask you to elaborate upon what you're setting out there in that last sentence about the advantages of a centrally funded blood transfusion service?
Well, I think it goes back to my earlier point about accountability to local regions or health authorities. If the big issues that we're concerned with are to do with the procurement of sufficient plasma to be self-sufficient in terms for England and Wales, well, these weren't matters of great debate in accountability discussions locally. And it would, if these are big goals for the England and Wales service, then the accountability discussions and the funding discussions should have been taking place centrally with whatever authority was set up to do that. And we would, I suppose if you would have a sort of analogy in World War II times, you would never expect enough Spitfires to be made if all the responsibility for doing that was handed out to different parts of the United Kingdom. It has to be an efficient, centrally managed operation. And the arrangement of accountability being held locally, the sort of accountability discussions didn't greatly concentrate on the issues that were important for the service itself, safety, self-sufficiency, and such like. And that was what was going through my mind in this paragraph.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, as you've already alluded to, Dr. Napier, there was no National Blood Transfusion Service as such, although that was on the heading on the note paper of the communications that were sent. There were essentially a series of autonomous regional transfusion centres, each with a relationship with their health authority, but with no national body to whom all the regional transfusion centres reported. Is that right?
It is. It is, yes.
If we look at a document from Dr. Tovey in 1980, it's at BPLL 0007561. The first page refers to a meeting, not one which involved you, Dr. Napier, a meeting at the Department of Health in February 1980. But if we go over the page, you'll see there's a short paper here called Proposed Plan for Reorganization of the National Blood Transfusion Service. If we just go to the bottom of the next page, we can see the date and author. So it's 28th of February 1980. And it's authored by Dr. Tovey, Consultant Advisor in Blood Transfusion. Can we go back to the second page, please, the top paragraph? Just want to ask for your observations on what's set out in the first paragraph here, Dr. Napier, where Dr. Tovey says this: there's been agreement for nearly 3 years between consultant staff of regional transfusion centres, directors of central laboratories of the NBTS, and senior officers of the DHSS, that the increasing national role now demanded of the blood transfusion service is suffering from constraints arising from regional development, inadequate central coordination and financing, and a poor integration of the activities of regional transfusion centres. Are those observations with which you agreed, Dr. Napier, at the time?
Yes, completely.
And then, insofar as there was coordination between regional transfusion centres, is it right to understand that that was largely through the regular meetings of regional transfusion directors that took place?
Yes, it was. We would discuss the various standards that we were aspiring to in terms of blood collection, technical and medical issues, we'd discuss plans that we were making as part of the self-sufficiency procurement of plasma. We'd be agreeing about that, but of course those plans ideas had to be taken back to discussion regionally. And of course, many of those issues are you need a long-term planning frame. We're talking about scaling up and development progressively over a number of years. And that wasn't handled, there wasn't a proper platform for handling that in local areas or regional health authorities.
Now, in terms of the mechanics of the regional transfusion director meetings, I think they were roughly quarterly, roughly 4 times a year. I just want to ask you about PRSE 301355. This is a regional transfusion directors meeting in January 1988, at which you were present. We'll look at various other meetings over the course of your evidence in relation to particular issues under discussion. But if we just go to paragraph 2, it says confidentiality of RTD meetings. The chairman asked directors to bear in mind that discussions taking place during RTD meetings should be regarded as confidential. This was essential if debate was to be full and frank. Dr. Rogers indicated that he had reservations about this position, particularly when the whole future of the service was under discussion. The chairman indicated that he was not asking for closed ranks, but felt that he expressed the view of those present in saying that direct quotation from discussions was unacceptable. What was your understanding of the confidentiality of the meetings? What did that permit you to share about discussions, and what did it prohibit you from sharing?
I can't recall ever accepting that the bulk of the discussions in these transfusion meetings would be regarded as confidential. It's just possible there could have been some issues, but in general I felt that the minutes of those meetings could be shared. And in fact, I think within the Cardiff-based transfusion centre, those minutes will be discussed at our own management team meetings. I can't think of any issues which I personally would regard as confidential, although as with any committee agenda, there could at times be some items that could be confidential, but I can't recall any. And I felt that the deliberations of the transfusion service centre meetings should be shared by the management team of transfusion centres, because they were largely about medical and technical and productivity issues, which the whole team of the transfusion centres should be helping to deliver.
Now, you attended, I think, the majority of those regional transfusion director meetings from 1977 onwards. The meetings, or the system of meetings, came to an end in January 1989, and I just want to ask you about that. If we look at NHBT 00-18188, these are the minutes of the Regional Transfusion Directors meeting on the 18th of January 1989, and you are down as attending. If we go to the second page, please, you'll see a heading halfway down the page, National Directors Report, Communications with the Directorate. And if we pick it up on the top of the next page, it's about 8 or 9 lines down. There's a sentence beginning. The committee structure associated with the National Directorate was welcomed, and as the discussion of a medical/scientific RTD meeting developed, it became clear that any managerial role for the RTD meeting was regarded as superfluous. It was agreed that there was value in meeting once a year for a one-day scientific symposium, and it was agreed that this should be quite separate from the BBTS meetings and indeed should take place in the spring. There was then reference to there would be regular meetings between Dr. Gunson and Professor Cash. And then if we go to the next paragraph, it reads, Dr. Wagstaff summarised the discussion which led him to ask if it was the wish of those present that the RTD meeting should be discontinued and be replaced by an annual meeting open to all NBTS consultants with a scientific agenda. This was agreed unanimously. And this actually became the very last regional transfusion directors meeting. Do you recall the discussion of the cessation of this system of RTD meetings and what your views were on it?
I'm afraid I don't now, until I saw the documents that you made available to me. I had, it has slipped my mind. I had always felt that the regional transfusion directors meetings were helpful, and because it did enable, as far as I was concerned, in Cardiff, to meet and discuss issues either within the formal structure of the meeting or outside the formal structure, just to be sure that we fully understood the major points that we were concerned about, and to be sure that that the practices in Cardiff would be kept in step with practices elsewhere. The change in the arrangements from the regional transfusion directors to one in which the various regions of the UK, for example, the Wessex region or the London region, would get together with all the consultants of transfusion services as a group and discuss things, and they would then feed into a national forum. I think that was an acceptable substitute, but I think you need both formal and informal contact between senior staff at transfusion centres just to help make the service more cohesive. And I think the arrangement that was introduced of regional meetings within each region of England and Wales probably did allow that to happen.
There is one further account of this meeting at SBTS 40628_011. This is a note of that meeting of the 18th of January 1989. I'm afraid I don't know whose note it is. But if we go to the third page, there's an account of the decision-making process in relation to abolishing the regional transfusion directors' regular meetings. Starts halfway down the page. It says, Dr. Wagstaff took the chair. It's just below the handwritten bit, Shomik, so you're in the right place. So it says, there's a handwritten entry, Future of RTD Meetings. At this point, Dr. Wagstaff and Dr. Contreras joined the meeting. Dr. Wagstaff took the chair, and Dr. Contreras was invited to give her views on the future of RTD meetings, as this had been discussed in her division. She proposed that the RTD meetings be abolished. If the greater part of the time was to be devoted to clinical and scientific topics, perhaps BBTS was the proper venue. It was pointed out that at the BBTS, the majority of attendees were from hospital laboratories, so that any meeting of BTS consultants would have to be held as a fringe. Dr. Smith, whose last meeting it was, recommended an annual meeting of transfusion directors to discuss matters of major policy. Dr. Wagstaff considered that the RTD meetings were still useful for comparisons and exchanges of view. If the divisional meetings were to take the place of RTD meetings, then it was imperative that consultants must attend. With reference to Scotland, it was recognised that the only remaining formal contact across Hadrian's Wall would be between Dr. Gunson and Professor Cash as the national medical directors. Dr. Wagstaff invited comments and objections, but did not ask each director individually, and then there's reference to some directors being absent. And then the last sentence reads, there was no discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of dissolving the RTD meetings. Over the page, there's then the unknown author's comment. I'm not going to go through that, but if we look at the passage that's underlined, it says, anyway, none of this discussion took place. These are my personal views. And in the midst of a slightly nonplussed silence, Dr. Wagstaff concluded that the 210th was to be the last RTD meeting in its present form. Does that prompt your memory at all, Dr. Napier? I appreciate I'm asking you events of several decades ago, and it's one meeting amongst many.
I'm afraid it doesn't. I was slightly sorry that the RTD meetings were abolished. As I said, it did give a valuable opportunity to share ideas and be sure to help ensure that the Cardiff Centre was in step with the others. I felt that we're talking here about information sharing in terms of clinical and technical and scientific standards throughout the service. The RTD meetings did quite well. I think they weren't solving the problems of resourcing plasma procurement, and they weren't sort of solving the mechanics of implementing change as far as testing was microbiological testing of blood was concerned. Generally speaking, I think the RTD meetings were in agreement about the need for progress in these directions, but I think we didn't have the mechanism for effecting funding and change.
And then, as well as the RTD meetings, there were divisional meetings, and I think Wales fell within the Western Division. If we just look at a sample note, NHBT 0113569. Minutes of the NBTS Western Division meeting. This one happens to be the 10th of March 1981, and you were in attendance. And again, as I understand it from looking at the documents, there were fairly regular meetings. We don't have a record of all of them, but several times a year, the Western Division, which included Cardiff, met. Well, can you recall what the purpose was of those particular divisional meetings?
They would have the same agenda as the previous regional transfusion directors' meetings. They would have the advantage that all of the medical consultants of the transfusion service would attend the meetings. So the opportunities for discussion and sharing of ideas would be more efficient. But in essence, they would have the same purpose as the original regional transfusion centre meetings.
So it would be discussing on a more local level the issues that would have been discussed nationally through the regional transfusion directors.
That's right, yes.
What I want to come on to ask you about next, Dr. Napier, is the essential activities of a regional transfusion centre. I'm going to ask you to look at a document with me and help us understand the work that the centre did. This document is NHBT 309028. No, sorry, that's the wrong document. CBLA 302392, Shomik. This was a 1987 NHS management consultancy study. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of it, but there's a description of the functions of a regional transfusion centre at page 14. You'll see the heading there, Dr. Napier, RTC functions. And then it says this: there's no comprehensive and common definition of what the functions of an RTC are or should be. There is a range of core functions common to all centres, namely collecting blood, testing the blood collected, and as at 1987 it's for HIV, hepatitis B and syphilis, separating blood into components and freezing harvested plasma for transmission to BPL for fractionation, issuing blood and products to hospitals, providing a reference service to hospitals on grouping problems, providing a source of medical advice on transfusion and product-related problems. And then the paragraph continues, within these functions, there are differences in policy, procedures and organisation which are discussed in subsequent paragraphs. So if we just go back to paragraph 213 and the list of core functions, is that an accurate description from your perspective of the core functions of a regional transfusion centre in the 80s?
Yes, I think it is, yes.
And obviously I'll be asking you more about some of the particular activities in the course of the day. And then if we just go to the bottom paragraph on this page, it says, in addition to these activities, there are a range of other functions which have developed in all centres to a greater or lesser extent. And then these are set out. And I just wanted to ask you which of these additional functions were undertaken at Cardiff. So Plasmapheresis, perhaps first of all, you could just assist us by a layman's or an explanation in terms a layman will understand of what plasmapheresis was.
Right. Plasmapheresis is a technique whereby blood is collected from a donor, but it is then separated into the red cells and the plasma that the red cells are suspended into. This is usually done by some sort of centrifugal process, and if you centrifuge a bag of blood, the heavier component, the red cells, settle at the bottom, and at the top is a clear yellow fluid, which is the plasma. If that plasma is removed and taken away for laboratory purposes, the red cells can be returned to the donor. And so in that sense, the donor has given a donation, but they've had the red cells returned to them, and the plasma is made available for transfusion purposes. Initially, this was done in a technique called a manual plasmapheresis, i.e. the donor gave a pint of blood, it was taken to the laboratory and centrifuged in the way I described, the plasma removed and the red cells given back to the donor. It was then superseded by automated systems whereby the donor is, in a way, plugged into a machine, which is a sort of centrifuge in itself, and it's a continuously centrifuges the blood and returns the red cells and harvests the plasma. So in a session of about half an hour, a larger amount of plasma could be taken away from the donor, collected from the donor, and the donor keeps their red cells. And that is automated plasmapheresis. And it does allow donors to give their donation more frequently, because they're not giving the red cells, they're not having to replace the red cells, which take longer to replace. All they're donating is plasma, and that is, they can recover the plasma relatively quickly within a few days. So donors can turn up quite frequently for give blood by plasmapheresis, whereas they're limited to once every 6 months or so to give a whole blood donation.
So plasmapheresis is effectively, potentially, a means by which more plasma can be collected.
That's right, yes.
And plasmapheresis was, as I understand it, undertaken at the Cardiff Centre.
It was, yes.
Was it manual or the automated, or was it in fact both changing over time?
I've got no recollection now as to how much manual plasmapheresis would have been undertaken. There is an inherent problem in manual plasmapheresis because, as I said, the donor gives their donation, and that is a pack of blood which has to be taken away to be manually separated into red cells and plasma. And this comes back to my point of trying to have a system in which there are zero errors. One must ensure, of course, that the red cells that they have donated are returned to them and them only. Now, this sounds a fairly straightforward procedure, but obviously if you get a busy and fairly rushed operation, it's not inconceivable that mix-ups could occur. So the manual, the machine plasmapheresis never separates the blood from the donor. So there's no possibility that the donor could get anything other than their own red cells back. Also, it's a sterile system. There's no great opportunity for any contamination or infection to affect the blood collection process. With a manual plasmapheresis, it's a little bit less easy to ensure that's a completely aseptic procedure. So the machine plasmapheresis allows more frequent donations, it allows more plasma to be collected, and I think is inherently safer.
And then the next, as it were, non-core function, so function undertaken at some but not all centres, described here was production of reagents. Was that something undertaken at the Cardiff Centre in the 80s?
Yes, I think in common with most transfusion centres, we produced blood grouping reagents and supplied those to the local hospitals.
Research and development. So sorry, Dr. Napier, carry on.
Yes, another arm of activity was the production of quality control reagents and quality control systems to enable all the hospital blood banks to be sure that their blood grouping and cross-matching procedures met commonly agreed error-free standards.
And then research and development. To what extent was the Cardiff Centre able to undertake research and development work?
I think we would take part in any UK agreed research activities that were undertaken. I wouldn't say this was a major part of our activity at the Cardiff Transfusion Centre.
Okay. Microbiological testing regimes. What was the role of that within the centre?
Well, this relates to the normal process of donation testing for the microbiological agents we've talked about: HIV, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, and syphilis. The procedures for doing this evolved over time from early manual procedures to eventually computer-controlled, highly modernized procedures.
And then quality control and tissue typing are the other two functions there listed. Was that part and parcel of, I think quality control you've already referred to?
Yes, the Cardiff operated a very large and successful tissue typing service to support the local bone marrow transplantation and renal transplantation service. So this was one of the very bigger parts of our non-core function activities. At least it's a core function as far as the local transplantation services were concerned, but it's not something that would be identically operated in all regional transfusion centres.
Now that, if we just go back to the previous paragraph 213, what I want to ask you about next is the third core function there described, the separation of blood into components, freezing harvested plasma for transmission to BPL. I'm just going to ask you to help us understand the various different components and fractions that would have been produced at the centre and those which would have been produced elsewhere. And I'm going to ask you to do that by reference to a document which you co-authored in 1988. It's NHBT 0099310_002. Please show me. So we can see this is Handbook of Transfusion Medicine, and there's edited by Dr. McClelland, and then a list of contributors, of which you are one. And then if we go to the next page, we can see the date 1988. We go to page 3, please, just so that we can see the purpose of this document. The preface explains this handbook has been produced at the request of the directors of the UK Transfusion Services as a successor to the publication Notes on Transfusion. It's intended for use by medical and other healthcare personnel as a source of information about blood component therapy and the clinical use of plasma fractions. And then if we go to the next page, when it says who this book is for, this book is for staff who are responsible for prescribing or administering blood products. It aims to give practical information about the composition and use of these products. A small number of problems account for most of the difficulties and dangers associated with transfusion. For example, delay in obtaining of compatible blood when the patient needs it urgently, transfusion of blood which was intended for someone else, over-transfusion leading to heart failure and viral infection from transfused products. This book is intended to help clinicians to avoid the avoidable risks and to explain those which are unavoidable so they can be taken into account when clinical decisions are made about transfusion for individual patients. So before we look at some of the details of the handbook, Dr. Napier, is it right to understand that this was essentially a manual intended to be used in hospitals by clinicians who were administering or treating patients with blood and blood products?
Yes, the intention was that every junior doctor should have a copy of this handbook, and this would supplement their previous medical training in transfusion, but it would try to get over the message that blood was, there were more issues concerned with the prescription and use of blood than might be normally considered with the administration of other drugs and such like that they will be responsible for. We were trying to suggest that there had to be judgments about the need for transfusion and when perhaps transfusion could be dispensed with, and bearing in mind the possible risks that might occur with transfusion. Admittedly, we hoped they were rare, but to introduce a note of caution in the transfusion process.
And then if we turn to page 5, we've got a section headed Blood Product Descriptions and General Information Terminology. And I'm just going to, because you're our first Regional Transfusion Director to be giving evidence, Dr. Napier, I'm just going to ask you to look at this with me so that we can understand some of the terminology that we then see appear in a range of the different documents. So it says, in this book, the term blood products is used for all therapeutic materials made from blood and includes both blood components and plasma fractions. The term blood components refers to red cell preparations, platelet concentrate, fresh plasma and cryoprecipitate. These are usually issued in packs containing the components prepared from a single blood donation or pulled together from a small number of donations. Just pausing there, would it be right to understand, Dr. Napier, that the blood components that are there described are all components that would be, as it were, processed by and issued by the transfusion centre?
Yes, these are ones which are prepared by the transfusion centre. They've usually got a fairly short shelf life, and they require specific storage conditions. Red cells, for example, at refrigerated temperatures. Platelet concentrates have a slightly higher temperature, but they're all short shelf life products made by separating the constituent parts of a whole blood donation, and they have to be stored under special conditions. They have a short shelf life.
And then if we skip down 2 paragraphs to the paragraph where plasma fractions is underlined, plasma fractions, as distinct from blood components, are the plasma protein preparations produced from bulk pooled donor plasma. Now, again, we'll look at the various different forms of those, but broadly speaking, is it right to understand those would not have been produced at the centre? Those effectively are products that would be produced by BPL, as far as Cardiff was concerned, from the plasma that was supplied by the centre to BPL.
Yes, that's correct. Our aim was to produce source plasma to send it to BPL, and they manufactured plasma fractions, which are in essence bottled, stable preparations with a relatively long shelf life and rather less demanding storage conditions. For example, plasma protein fraction for resuscitation, etc., or coagulation factors which could be stored in people's refrigerators at home, and so are much more flexible in terms of distribution and storage than the blood components, and with a much longer shelf life.
And so if we then look at the bottom half of the page, we just look at some of the blood components that were then produced and processed within the centre. We've got, first of all, the red cell components, and those could be take a number of different forms, as I understand this. The first is whole blood. We can see there the third paragraph describes the infection risk, not sterilised, so capable of transmitting any agent present in cells or plasma which has not been detected by routine donor screening, including hepatitis B, hepatitis non-A, non-B, HIV-1 and other viruses. And then we can see in terms of storage, may be stored up to 5 weeks if collected in a suitable anticoagulant. And then if we go over the page, we've got a description of the indications. Whole blood should not be used routinely for red cell replacement, should be restricted to situations where the patient requires replacement of plasma coagulation factors as well as red cells. Just pausing there, is it right to understand, Dr. Napier, that by the time we get to the publication of this manual, this handbook in 1988, whole blood is less frequently used. Red cell concentrates or red cell components were more frequently used for ordinary transfusions. But if we go back to the 70s, we'd have seen a much greater usage of whole blood.
Yes, that's correct. Whole blood was the traditional transfusion material, and that's what surgeons and physicians would have expected to use to replace blood loss during surgery or to correct anemia. But as particularly the decade of the late 70s and the 80s took place, there was a need to harvest more and more plasma for blood, the blood fractions that we've talked about. And that meant that we had to encourage the practice of giving red cell units alone with the plasma removed for clinical purposes.
And then if we just go the next paragraph, but one, we've got a heading fresh whole blood. And it says in most centres this is not generally available. Can you recall whether fresh whole blood was something issued by the Cardiff Centre during your time there?
Yes, indeed. There was a clinical perception that fresh whole blood would have a number of advantages which were clinically significant. Fresh whole blood undoubtedly carries a more efficient in terms of oxygen transport than blood which has been stored a long time, although the blood's oxygen carrying capacity does regenerate after transfusion, but fresh whole blood, it's immediately high quality in terms of oxygen transport. The fresh whole blood would also have a much higher level of coagulation factor content, but the majority of medical transfusion circumstances don't need that. It's quite sufficient to give blood which has been kept or blood banked for a few days.
And the risk, as detailed here, of using fresh whole blood is that the microbiological testing procedures that would ordinarily be carried out would not have been completed.
I think it's unlikely, and I can't remember dates, I think it's unlikely that a transfusion centre would want to release any blood that hadn't undergone the requisite microbiological testing. I think this might have happened at some stage in the past under situations of extreme desperation, but I think, generally speaking, it would be very difficult to persuade a transfusion service to release blood that hadn't undergone its requisite testing. But I think there was there was formerly a clinical expectation that fresh whole blood had some qualities which would be lost in storage, and there would sometimes be pressures to request fresh whole blood. But by and large, with debate between clinicians and hospitals and in blood services, I think it was generally agreed that these would be extremely rare circumstances, and by and large, I think the issue of fresh whole blood was almost never took place latterly.
And then we've got red cell concentrates. I'm not going to go through the detail. There's various different, as it were, manifestations of that described in this document. But essentially, the red cell concentrates, we're told here, same infection risk as whole blood, same storage requirements as whole blood. And then there are different forms of packs described that I don't think we need to go through. If we then go to page 7, well, just to complete this document before we break. Bottom of the left-hand column, we've got a heading platelet components. I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but is it right to understand that these, again, were components that were produced by and supplied by the Regional Transfusion Centre?
Yes, they were.
And the indications in relation to platelet components, we can see it on the right-hand column of this page. Third paragraph down, indications. So there might be a range of different clinical situations in which platelet components, such as platelet concentrate, would be required.
Yes, yes, that's true.
And then if we go to page 8, please, Shomik. Again, I'm going to not go through each and every different form of platelet component, but we then get bottom right-hand corner, we get plasma components, fresh frozen plasma, infection risk can transmit hepatitis, HIV and other viruses. Storage can be stored for up to 1 year. And then if we go to the next page, and we look at the right-hand column, we get cryoprecipitate, described as prepared from fresh frozen plasma, and there's a description of the process there. Infection risk as for plasma, a normal adult dose involves at least 6 donor exposures. And then again, we have the description of storage at minus 30 degrees or below for up to 1 year. So the Cardiff Centre and all regional transfusion centres would produce, amongst other products, fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate to a greater or lesser extent, depending upon the time.
Yes, they certainly would.
And then we get to the plasma fractions, which we can take very quickly because these were not produced at the centre. So bottom of this page, we've got factor VIII concentrate. We go over the page, just nearly halfway down the left-hand column, we've got factor IX concentrate. And then we have a description of various immunoglobulins and albumin. And the centre's role there, is this right, would be to send the plasma for fractionation at BPL, and then to receive back the completed products and supply the products to the hospitals within its area.
That's the case.
Thank you. So note the time. That's the overview I wanted to do in relation to some of the products. Perhaps we could take a break now.
Yes, just one question before we do take a break. Transfusion has, I think, a long history. Now, you were describing in that text how at the time that you wrote it in 1988, the blood taken from a donor would last for about 5 weeks if it was in an appropriate anticoagulant. I think, am I right in thinking that before transfusion became through the medium of a bottle or a bag, but was person to person, there was no need for anticoagulants. But once you have a bottle or a bag into which blood is harvested and from which it is then given to the recipient, there is a need for an anticoagulant in order to ensure that the process works. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, if blood is collected into any sort of container, it immediately starts to clot and become semi-solid and couldn't be transfused. It also needs a nutrient solution to keep the semi-living cellular constituents in a reasonable state of health until they're transfused. And so the developments in blood storage involved improving that nutrient storage solution. And the latest one that was developed was an optimal additive solution with citrate and phosphate and dextrose, and that allowed the red cells to be kept in a reasonable state for up to 5 weeks. But during that time, their oxygen carrying capacity does diminish, although, as I said, it does become restored a bit after transfusion. But the other problem with prolonged storage is that although it's an attempted aseptic process, collection and storage of blood, there is always a possibility of microbial contamination. And the longer the blood is kept, the longer that microbial contamination might manifest itself. So that presents a limit on the amount of time that these fresh components can be kept. The longer they're kept, the longer it might be that any contamination arises, and an infected blood component is disastrous for a recipient.
Now, the anticoagulant you were describing in 1987-88 was not, I think, the same anticoagulant as had been used in the early 70s, or for that matter, I suppose, the early 80s. You can tell me when it may have changed, because that was originally it was ACD, wasn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And
yes.
that allowed, what, 3-week shelf life?
It was generally agreed that 3 weeks was optimal for that. And it is related to the capacity of the transfused red cells to deliver the oxygen. That declines progressively during storage. So there is a sort of figure, a percentage. It was reckoned that once you reach to about 70% of the previous efficiency in oxygen delivery, then that was the limit that you could store it for. If the oxygen delivery capacity dropped below about 70% of the original figure, then that was regarded as unsatisfactory. But with the newer anticoagulants, that 70% figure was retained for longer. You keep it for about 5 weeks and still have about 70% of my memory is reliable. You still have about 70% efficiency. The surgeons are concerned, obviously, if they're transfusing red cells, they want instant red cell carriage and delivery. And that's why I think in the early days they were so concerned about fresh blood. In fact, the body can cope for a while. It can allow some hours to allow the red cell function to restore itself. So it's not so critical that it's 100% oxygen delivery capacity at the moment of transfusion. You can allow a little bit of time for the body to restore that. And so it's generally accepted if the blood had at least 70% of its original oxygen carrying capacity, that would be perfectly manageable.
So it's a bit like, is it having if one thinking in colloquial terms to get a useful analogy, a bit like putting something in your fridge with a sell-by date. As you approach the sell-by date, the product won't be quite so good as it once was.
Yes, that's an
and by the time you're at the sell-by date, you can still use it, but it's lost a lot of what you really want it for. It's your nutritional value, and it risks, I suppose, some form of contamination. Is that broadly the same process?
Yes, it is. I think the general understanding was that if you stuck to the shelf life, then you'd be very secure in terms of not having a risk of contamination, and you'd be confident that it would be physiologically as functional as you would expect it to be. But so it would not be regarded as safe or even permissible to transfuse beyond its stated shelf life.
And what you've been describing really is the process of the red blood cells losing their ability to carry oxygen. The plasma in which they were suspended, if it is whole blood, that could be recovered, could it, after the red blood cells had lost their value?
the plasma also, some of the constituents, for example, the clotting factor, factor 8, will degrade over time. So if blood is stored for more than a few days, you wouldn't have any confidence you would have any of that sort of factor 8 competence. Other aspects of plasma are viable for longer. It is, sometimes you regard it as a plasma expander. It is strictly volume infused in the circulation, and the circulation needs volume in the same way that a car needs enough oil to keep its oil pressure up. So the surgeons are looking for two dimensions. They're looking for oxygen carrying capacity of the blood they transfuse, and they're also looking for volume, because if a surgical patient is bleeding, then they're bleeding the volume of fluid in the same way a car might lose oil in its system. You have to replace the volume as well. But the volume can be replaced by alternatives. There's plasma, fresh plasma, which is not by and large used for volume replacement, but there are substitutes, plasma protein fraction, or even saline or synthetic materials, which can be short-term replacements for volume.
Thank you very much. Now, we'll take a break now until 5 to 12. Allow you to have a cup of coffee and a break. During the break, and indeed during any break that follows, including the overnight break which will come, what you must not do is discuss anything you've said in evidence with anyone, or anything that you think you might yet be asked with anyone. You can talk about anything else you like. So I look forward to seeing you back at 5 to 12.
Thank you.